Have you ever fallen in love at first sight? That minute your eyes lock and you feel the electricity, you immediately know there's a connection between you. I felt that way in 2013. The minute I saw him, I thought he was the most incredible thing I had ever seen. He stood about a foot tall, covered in light brown fur, standing on his hind legs with his front paws out like tiny hands. He looked at me with beady brown eyes and a little pink nose, and I fell in love. His name was Boodie, and he was a burrowing Bettong, a small kangaroo-like marsupial that lives in burrows. That night was a volunteer introduction evening at the Kanyana Wildlife Centre in Lesmurdie, where Kanyana was looking for more volunteers to look after both their sick and injured wildlife and the resident animals. Boodie was one of the residents, and as I now understand it, a secret weapon in volunteer recruitment. The minute anyone saw him, they wanted to sign up to volunteer, and that's what I did. Kanyana was started in the 1970s on the home of June and Lloyd Butcher, getting bigger and bigger until moving to its current location in 2010. Currently, with one paid staff member and approximately 300 volunteers who work 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Boodie had been a resident since 2005, when he'd been thrown from his mother's pouch as a tiny joey. The burrowing Bettong is a vulnerable species in Western Australia, so Boodie was kept as a resident animal for education purposes. In a centre of this size, the volunteers are a key component, so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the volunteer roles that people do at Kanyana. Initially, volunteers start off doing general feeding and cleaning of the animals in the hospital and the resident animals. Various residents have come and gone over the years, but at the moment there are bilbies and woylies, both part of threatened species breeding programs, stone curlews, echidnas, black cockatoos, and an emu. And every one of these animals has different feeding and housing requirements. Some volunteers take on a role in our education team, and that's where they take some of the resident animals out to schools or community groups to educate about our local wildlife. Boodie was always popular on these excursions because he was so different to what people were used to seeing. The minute anyone saw him, they wanted to touch him and find out what he was. Once a volunteer has got used to being a general volunteer, the general cleaning, they can go on to being a tube feeder. This is where you take a tube and insert it into the mouth of a bird down into the crop and force feed a special rearing mix. We do this with dove and parrot species who are not feeding themselves. Now, in order to learn bird anatomy, volunteers practice on dead birds. And believe me, it is much easier to force feed a dead bird that's not trying to fight you. That is, unless it is still frozen. So Kanyana uses the corpses from the wildlife hospital in its training, kept in the freezer, but they do have to be defrosted first. Unfortunately, all the training in the world does not prepare you for dealing with an angry adult galah. I still remember one bird. The minute I saw her, I knew we were going to have problems. But me, being a newly trained tube feeder and enthusiastic, I thought I could handle it. And I did, until her head rotated 360 degrees like something out of The Exorcist, and she bit down on my index finger. I trailed from one end of the hospital to the other, leaving blood the entire way, trying to get this bird off my hand. That wound went on and got infected. But I'm happy to report both the galah and I went on to make a full recovery. I didn't get to see Boodie much while volunteering as a tube feeder. I could only visit him at the start of my shift because I couldn't risk taking any diseases from the wildlife hospital down to our resident animals. Being nocturnal, in summer he was always sound asleep. In winter he would wake up earlier, and as soon as he heard somebody outside his enclosure, he would run up to the bars and look at you as if to say, "You got a nut?" Somehow the minute I saw him, my day always got better. But the work still went on at the hospital. Once a tube feeder has got all their competencies and still has 10 fingers, they can choose to go on to being a treatment assistant, giving medications to bobtails, mammals, birds, whatever comes in through the wildlife hospital under the supervision of a treatment person. From treatment assistant, you can move on to being a treatment person, assessing any injured wildlife that comes in by members of the public. Now, as much as I wanted to be a treatment person when I first started my journey with Kanyana, I do think that's the hardest job because of the amount of wildlife that doesn't make it. Sometimes that's the natural order of things, but sometimes it's due to the intervention of man, such as watching beautiful boobook owls and barn owls die due to rodenticide poisoning. While these do get rid of the rodents in your house, they also make anything that preys on rodents very, very sick. This includes birds of prey, kookaburras, tawny frogmouths, and even pet cats and dogs. When they see a slow-moving rodent, they think they're getting an easy feed, not realising it could be their last meal. Sometimes humans intervene through kindness. The rescuer that's had a bird for 5 days brings it in because it's still not flying. Unfortunately, the untrained person hasn't recognised the bones of the wing are sticking out in a complicated fracture, and the bird will never fly again. Sometimes a good death is better than a bad life. While treatment people mainly work in the hospital, we do also give treatments to any of our resident animals that require it. Elle, one of our resident echidnas, had a wound on her foot that needed ointment. I sat cross-legged on the ground, gently rolled her onto her back in my lap. Now don't try this at home. It does go easier with a tame animal who is used to being handled. And Elle was great about it. I put the ointment on a cotton bud, put it on her foot, and then I started getting a warm feeling. I texted a friend that night. I've just been peed on by an echidna. How's your Tuesday going? Boodie also got to the stage of needing treatments. He got old and stiff and required anti-inflammatories. But he was very easy to treat. You just had to hold the syringe out to him and he'd grasp it with his front paws and lick the medicine off the end. I remember the last time I saw Boodie. The minute I saw him, I knew he wasn't long for this world. We lost him in 2018, and while he lived a long and healthy life, he broke the heart of every volunteer. So you might wonder why the volunteers do it. For most of us, it's so we can try and counter some of the impacts of development. Somehow we try and lessen the injuries that wildlife may suffer when they have a run-in with a motor vehicle, a whippersnapper, a rodenticide. The goal is always to get the animals 100% fit and healthy so they can be released to the wild. Very few animals are kept as resident animals, and that's only after a long approval process. So I ask you to work with the volunteers and keep an eye on the wildlife around you. The bobtail in your garden that's not trying to get away may well have an upper respiratory tract infection or the bobtail flu and be slowly starving to death. The magpie that's got wounds around its head may have throatworm and face being pecked to death by other birds. Use a thick towel to pick up any of these injured animals and take them to get checked out by your local vet or wildlife shelter. Unless it's a potentially venomous snake. Then keep your eyes on the snake and call a snake relocator. And as for me, well, you know what I'm doing next Tuesday night, because in the words of Jane Goodall, only if we understand will we care. Only if we care will we act. Only if we act shall all be saved.